My daughter-in-law just called me a foolish old woman in French at her book launch party. I'm Margaret Wells. And Victoria thought I didn't know what she said when she told her publishing friends that my gift was cheap junk from a confused grandmother. But the old cookbook in my hands wasn't junk. It was a first edition Julia Child manuscript worth $750,000. And Victoria had no idea that her mean words had just started something she couldn't stop. You see, Victoria thought 3 things about me tonight. First, that I don't speak French. Second, that I know nothing about cooking history. And third, that I'm just some simple housewife who accidentally joined her fancy book world. She was completely wrong about everything. Totally wrong. What happened next didn't just show her mistake. It revealed everything she thought she knew about her husband's biggest secret. If you like this story, please subscribe and write a comment telling me which country you're watching from, because things are about to get really exciting. Let me go back and tell you how I got into this mess. 4 years ago, when Victoria married my son Daniel, I made a choice that probably helped our family. I chose to hide my real job. See, Victoria had just lost her older brother Marcus in a boat accident. He was 23, a famous young chef in Boston, and his death had broken her heart. She couldn't cook anymore. Couldn't be near anything that made her remember his talent, his dreams, his future that would never come. So when Daniel brought home this sad young woman who was trying to build a new life writing books about art, far away from cooking, I made a decision. I didn't tell her I was Chef Margaret Wells, who had just stopped working at the Culinary Institute after 40 years. I didn't mention that I knew everything about French cooking masters. I didn't talk about my work helping museums or my collection of rare recipe books. Instead, I became Maggie the baker, which wasn't really a lie. I did bake cakes for neighbors as a fun hobby, staying close to the ovens I'd spent my whole life studying. But it wasn't the complete truth either. Victoria needed a mother-in-law who wouldn't remind her of her brother's cooking world. So that's what I gave her. For 4 years, I've watched her slowly get better, build her book writing business, feel good about writing about paintings, make a new life that didn't include the terrible weight of cooking talent lost too soon. But I've also watched her change into someone different, someone colder, meaner to people she thinks are below her smart level. Tonight's book launch at Sterling Publishers in downtown was supposed to be special. Daniel had asked me to come, said Victoria was finally ready to accept me better. He even said I should bring her something nice, a friendship gift to show I understood her world. That's when I remembered the cookbook. I'd bought it 6 years ago from an old ladies' sale in Vermont. The old owner, Mrs. Romano, was selling her late sister's collection of cooking stuff. Most of it was normal things, sign menus, old kitchen tools, copied recipes. But hidden in a box of random papers was something amazing, an unpublished Julia Child recipe collection. Recipes from Paris dated 1949. Getting a check took 3 years and cost me $15,000. The National Cooking Library in Washington confirmed the paper and handwriting. Christie's gave the $750,000 price. The Child Foundation checked the writing against other known examples. I planned to give it to a museum, but when Daniel asked me to bring Victoria something special, something that might help us become closer, I thought maybe this was the right time. Maybe it was time to start showing the space between Maggie the baker and Chef Wells. I should have known this was a bad idea. The Sterling Publishers building was filled with New York's book important people. Shiny marble floors showed fancy lights that cost more than most people's houses. I stood near the back wall in my simple gray sweater and comfortable old shoes, watching fancy people talk about sales numbers and book deals. Victoria walked over with her usual professional smile, nice black dress perfectly fitted, followed by important book buyers I knew from Publishers Weekly magazine, people whose opinions could make or destroy writers' careers. Maggie. Victoria's hello was warm enough, but I could see the little worry in her eyes. Having her simple mother-in-law at her work event wasn't perfect. Daniel said you had something for me. I handed her the protective folder holding the cookbook. Through the clear plastic, old yellow paper showed handwritten recipes in faded ink. Victoria took it with the polite happiness of someone getting an unwanted present. Cookbook. That's sweet. And that's when everything went very wrong. Victoria held the cookbook up to look at it, and I could see her face change from polite interest to barely hidden laughing. The small crowd around us, publishing helpers, book bloggers, possible buyers, felt something happening and moved closer. Interesting, Victoria said, her voice just loud enough to include her audience. Where did you find this, Maggie? At a sale in Vermont, I answered honestly. Victoria nodded like she understood, sharing a look with her friends. Estate sales. You have to be very careful with those. Lots of fake copies everywhere. The way she said fake copies made it clear what she thought of my purchase. One of the buyers, a man in an expensive blue suit, leaned closer. What kind of cookbook is it? Appears to be French recipes, Victoria said, tilting the cookbook toward him. Probably printed from a website. You can get anything from computers these days. If I stayed quiet now, several things would happen, and none of them good. First, my friendship with Victoria would stay frozen forever. She'd always see me as the well-meaning but silly mother-in-law who embarrassed her at work events. Our family dinners would become even harder, filled with her patient looking down on me attitude. Second, Daniel would blame himself. He'd planned this evening just to bring Victoria and me together. He'd spent weeks convincing me to come, promising it would be a chance for us to find friendship. Watching his gift moment turn into shame would hurt him deeply. Third, Victoria would never understand what she'd actually received, never know the importance of the recipes in her hands or how they connected to the brother she'd lost. But the worst part was watching the crowd's reaction. These weren't mean people. They were just following Victoria's example, taking hints from someone they respected in the book world. If Victoria had treated my gift with curiosity instead of dismissal, they would have been interested. Instead, they were learning it was okay to look down on the old woman with the fake cookbook. The paper looks new, said a young publishing helper, trying to impress Victoria with her noticing skills. Victoria nodded approvingly. Exactly. Real old cookbooks have specific aging signs. This is clearly modern paper, probably laser printed. The circle of watchers had grown to include 15 people now. Book buyers, magazine writers, publishing workers, all watching Victoria show her knowledge at my expense. Plus, Victoria continued, getting more confident. Real cookbooks come with papers, history documents, checking certificates, museum verification. They don't just show up in plastic sleeves from Office Depot. More knowing giggles from the crowd. Victoria, Daniel said quietly, appearing at my side. Maybe we should. No, it's fine, Victoria interrupted, her professional personality fully working. This is actually helpful. People need to understand how to spot fake copies in the market. She pointed toward the cookbook like a teacher with a teaching tool. See, real cooking manuscripts, especially valuable ones, are super rare. The chances of finding a real piece by a major chef at a random estate sale are basically zero. The crowd whispered agreement. Victoria's thinking was correct, her knowledge unquestioned. And let's be honest, Victoria continued. Even if this were somehow real, what would a home baker be doing with a cookbook worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? That got the biggest laugh yet. The silliness of the simple lady owning museum-quality cooking history struck everyone as really funny. But then Victoria made her big mistake. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the excitement of performing for her friends. Maybe it was just years of stored frustration with having a mother-in-law who didn't fit her carefully chosen world. Whatever the reason, Victoria switched to French. My friends, she said to her companions, this is exactly the problem with people like my mother-in-law. They don't understand the difference between real cooking history and cheap fake copies. The words hurt me like a punch, not because of the insult. I'd been called worse things by better people, but because of the easy cruelty, the thinking that I couldn't understand the performance of being better for an audience. Mother doesn't know anything about food culture, Victoria continued, building confidence from her friends' happy smiles. She thinks a piece of paper with written recipes on it is valuable because she bought it at a garage sale. Mother knows nothing about food culture. She thinks a piece of paper with written recipes has value because she bought it at a yard sale. Daniel was looking confused. He didn't speak French, but I understood every word. The question was, how long was I going to let this continue? Victoria was just getting started. The French had made her tongue loose, made her feel safe in her being better than others. Her audience was enjoying the show, even if they couldn't understand the words. And look how she's standing there, Victoria continued in French, pointing toward me with acting pity. She probably thinks she's made a major discovery, a hidden treasure. And look how she stands there. She probably thinks she's made a major finding, a secret valuable thing. The crowd's laughter was getting more sure. They were feeding off Victoria's energy, enjoying the culture being better than others she was showing. But then something unexpected happened. A woman I hadn't noticed before stepped closer to look at the cookbook. She was well dressed, probably in her 60s, with a kind of focused attention that suggested real knowledge rather than social showing off. "Excuse me," she said to Victoria, "but could I take a closer look at that?" Victoria paused her French talking. "Of course, though I should warn you, it's almost definitely a fake copy." The woman, I'd later learn she was Chef Patricia Klein, a famous restaurant owner, studied the cookbook through its protective sleeve with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen thousands of recipe collections. "The handwriting style is interesting," she said carefully. "Very similar to mid-20th century French cooking writers." Victoria's confidence shook slightly. "Well, yes, whoever made the fake copy did their homework, but the paper quality gives it away immediately." Chef Klein looked up at Victoria with a small frown. "Actually, the paper looks quite real to me. That's definitely old paper stock. You can tell by the feel and the way the ink has settled into the material." The crowd's energy changed. Victoria's story was being questioned by someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. "Sorry, who are you?" Victoria asked, her business instincts working. "Patricia Klein. I own 3 restaurants in Manhattan, and I've handled quite a few historical cookbooks in my time." Victoria's face got slightly red. She was losing control of her audience, and she knew it. "Chef Klein," Victoria said, forcing a friendly smile. "I appreciate your input, but I deal with checking real versus fake issues professionally. This cookbook simply doesn't have the proper papers to be considered real." "What kind of papers would you expect?" Chef Klein asked. Victoria grabbed the chance to get back her authority. "History papers from the source place, checking certificates from places like the National Cooking Library, price assessments from known auction houses like Christie's or Sotheby's." She turned back to me, switching to English but keeping the looking down tone. "Maggie, you mentioned this came from an estate sale. Did the seller give any paperwork, any documents at all?" This was my moment. I could have pulled out the checking folder I'd brought with me. 4 years of paperwork proving every word Victoria had just said was necessary. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of watching Victoria slowly heal from her brother's death, seeing her build a new identity around bookwriting because cooking was too painful. Maybe it was my own guilt about the lie I'd kept for 4 years. Or maybe it was just curiosity. How far would Victoria take this show? How cruel would she get when she thought she was safe? "I have some papers at home," I said simply. Victoria's smile became really pitying. "Maggie, I'm sure you have some kind of certificate saying it's real, but you have to understand those are easy to fake. Real checking requires museum verification." She turned back to Chef Klein, professional to professional. "The problem with estate sales is that people find things they don't understand and make up stories around them. They want to believe they've discovered something valuable, so they pay for fake papers to support that belief." Chef Klein was studying my face now, not the cookbook. Something about my look seemed to interest her. "What's the chef listed on this piece?" Chef Klein asked. Victoria glanced at the cookbook. "Julia Child, Recipes from Paris, dated 1949. Chef Klein's eyebrows went up. "Recipes from Paris. I've never heard of that collection." "Exactly," Victoria said happily. "Because it doesn't exist. Child never wrote a collection with that title." But Chef Klein was shaking her head. Actually, that's not completely true. Child wrote dozens of small recipe sets that were never published. Many were practice runs for friends or cooking students, and they've been lost to history. Victoria's confidence was breaking now. Her simple story of lies and fooling was becoming complicated by actual knowledge. Chef Klein, Victoria said carefully. Surely you're not saying that this could be a real child cookbook? I'm saying, Chef Klein replied, that dismissing it without proper looking would be too quick. The crowd was completely silent now, feeling tension between the two women. Victoria's book World Authority was being questioned by cooking knowledge, and the result wasn't certain. That's when Robert Martinez, the publishing owner, walked toward our group. He'd been watching the conversation from across the room, and his face suggested worry. Victoria, he said quietly, perhaps we should continue this talk privately. But Victoria was too deep in now. Her reputation was at risk in front of possible clients, and she couldn't afford to back down. Robert, it's fine, she said. I think it's important that people understand how to judge real versus fake claims. She held up the cookbook again, her voice carrying across the building. This is a perfect example of wishful thinking becoming expensive confusion. My mother-in-law has convinced herself she owns a valuable child cookbook, probably based on some forged paper she bought along with it. Victoria looked directly at me. Maggie, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but you need to accept reality here. This is a fake copy, probably worth about $15 at most. $15 for a cookbook I'd spent 4 years and $15,000 checking. For a collection of recipes that had changed my understanding of child's early period. For a cooking document that, unknown to everyone in this room, had a connection to Victoria's family that would break everything she thought she knew about her brother's death. I looked around the building at the faces watching me, some feeling sorry, some amused, all waiting to see how the old woman would handle being shown as a fool. And I made my choice. Victoria, I said quietly, before you continue, I have a question. Something in my tone made the crowd pause. Maybe it was the stillness in my voice, or the way I'd stopped looking embarrassed and started looking focused. What's your question, Maggie? Victoria asked, still confident, but feeling a change in the room's energy. You mentioned that real cookbooks come with papers from places like the National Cooking Library. That's correct. And price assessments from auction houses like Christie's. And that child never wrote a collection called Recipes from Paris. Victoria nodded. But it's not in any list of her works. Chef Klein was watching me carefully now. Robert Martinez had moved closer, his face troubled. Interesting, I said. Because you seem to know quite a bit about cooking checking for someone who works only in book publishing. Victoria's smile shook slightly. I make it my business to understand all areas of the book market, including 20th century French chefs. I have a wide culture education. From where? The question seemed to surprise Victoria. From where? What? Where did you study French cooking history? Which teachers? Which books? Victoria's confidence was shaking now. I'm mostly self-taught in that area. I nodded thoughtfully. So when you say child never wrote recipes from Paris, you're basing that on the standard lists of her works. Which lists specifically? Victoria was beginning to look uncomfortable. The standard ones, the complete lists. Chef Klein stepped forward. Actually, there is no single complete list of Child's unpublished works. The Child Foundation has been working on that project for many years, but it's far from done. Victoria shot Chef Klein an annoyed look. Fine, but the point remains. This cookbook doesn't have proper papers. You're completely right, I agreed. Proper papers are important. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder I'd been carrying all evening, which is why I brought this. Victoria's face went white as I opened the folder to show a stack of official documents. Even from far away, the letter tops were clearly visible. National Cooking Library, Christie's Manuscripts Department, the Child Foundation. What is that? Victoria asked weakly. The papers you said were necessary, I replied. Checking certificate from the National Cooking Library. Reference number NCL 202405521. Christie's price assessment dated April 2024. And verification from the Child Foundation confirming the cookbook's realness. The building had gone completely silent. Everyone was staring at the folder in my hands. Chef Klein was the first to speak. May I see those? I handed her the documents. She studied them carefully, her face growing more amazed with each page. These are real, she said softly. This is real museum checking. She looked up at Victoria. Do you understand what you're holding? Victoria was staring at the papers like they were written in a strange language. That's how did you the question, Victoria, is not how I got proper checking, I said. The question is why you were so certain I couldn't have. Robert Martinez was reading over Chef Klein's shoulder. Chef Wells, he said suddenly. His voice filled with knowing. Everyone turned to look at him. You're Chef Margaret Wells, he continued. From the Culinary Institute. I published your textbook on French cooking techniques 5 years ago. The building crowd stirred. The name meant something to them, even if they couldn't place it immediately. Chef. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. Chef Klein looked up from the documents with new understanding. Margaret Wells, of course. You're the top expert on French cooking masters in America. Retired, I said simply. Victoria was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. You're a chef at the Culinary Institute. I was for 40 years. But you bake cakes. I've seen your kitchen. I bake cakes because I enjoy staying connected to the ovens. It's a hobby, not a job. The crowd was whispering now, rethinking everything they'd seen. Victoria's expert dismissal of my gift had just been shown as uninformed showing off. But there was something else in Victoria's eyes now, something beyond embarrassment or shock. Recognition. Because if I was Chef Margaret Wells, expert on French cooking masters, then I would have known about her brother Marcus. I would have known about his talent, his training, his tragic death. And suddenly, the cookbook in her hands felt very different. Victoria was struggling to process what she'd learned. But her survival instincts were working. She couldn't afford to fall apart in front of her professional friends, no matter how wrong she'd been. This doesn't make sense, she said, her voice gaining strength. If you're really a Culinary Institute chef, why didn't you ever tell me? Why let me think you were just a home baker? It was a good question, and it temporarily moved the focus away from her own mistakes. You never asked about my background, I replied. But Daniel must have known. He would have told me. I looked at my son, who was staring at me with his mouth open. Daniel, did you know I was a chef? No, he whispered. You always just said you worked with food. Victoria grabbed onto this. So, you've been lying to your own son for years, hiding your real identity. The accusation hung in the air. Victoria was trying to reframe the situation. Make me the lying one instead of facing her own shame. I never lied, I said calmly. I work with food. I just didn't specify in what way. That's word games, Victoria shot back. Why would you hide being a chef? Why pretend to be something you're not? The crowd was with her again. Her thinking felt correct. Why would anyone hide such respected credentials? Victoria, Robert said quietly. Maybe this isn't the place. No, Victoria interrupted, her confidence returning. I think we deserve an explanation. This whole situation is strange. A retired chef pretending to be a working-class baker showing up at my book launch with $1 million cookbook she's apparently been hiding. She turned to address the crowd directly. Don't you think this is strange? Why would someone hide their knowledge and then dramatically reveal it like this? Whispers of agreement moved through the building. Victoria was successfully redirecting their focus from her own mistakes to my supposed lying. And another thing, Victoria continued, warming to her idea. If Chef Wells really is an expert on French chefs, why didn't she correct me earlier? Why let me embarrass myself before revealing her credentials? Chef Klein looked troubled. That is an interesting question. Victoria nodded eagerly. Exactly. It's like she was setting me up, waiting for me to make mistakes so she could shame me publicly. The crowd was nodding now. Victoria's story was believable. The vengeful chef planning her daughter-in-law's public embarrassment. Which raises another question, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. Why this cookbook? Why this specific collection? Chef Wells could have brought any number of real cooking documents to show her knowledge. Why choose something so dramatically expensive? Why choose something designed to make my dismissal look as foolish as possible? Daniel was looking back and forth between us, confusion and hurt clear on his face. Victoria, he said quietly. You're being paranoid. Am I? Victoria turned to him. Daniel, think about it. Your mother has been lying to us for 4 years about who she really is. Tonight she shows up at my book launch with nearly $1 million worth of recipes, lets me publicly mock it, then dramatically reveals her true identity to maximum shaming effect. She pointed to the crowd. If that's not a setup, what is it? The thinking was working. People were nodding, seeing the pattern Victoria was describing. And you know what the worst part is? Victoria's voice was rising now. This whole performance is about cooking, French cooking, the one subject she knows I can't bear to discuss. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. This was getting personal. My brother died 4 years ago, Victoria announced to the room. Marcus was a chef student, incredibly talented, and his death destroyed our family. Chef Wells knows this. Daniel must have told her, so what does she do? She brings me French recipes, waits for me to reject them, then uses my rejection to shame me. Victoria's eyes were bright with tears now, but her voice stayed strong. That's not just lying, it's cruel, using my grief against me to plan some kind of twisted revenge. The building was completely silent. Victoria had reframed the entire evening, made herself the grieving sister being played by a calculating chef who'd used insider knowledge of family tragedy to plan public shame. Robert looked upset. Chef Klein was shaking her head sadly. Even Daniel seemed uncertain now. Victoria, I said quietly. That's not what, isn't it? Victoria interrupted. Then explain it to me, chef. Explain why you hid your identity for 4 years. Explain why you chose tonight to reveal it. Explain why you picked French cooking, the one thing guaranteed to trigger my grief, as your weapon of choice. Victoria held up the cookbook like evidence in a trial. This isn't a gift, Chef Wells. This is mind warfare, and everyone in this room just watched you do it. The crowd was completely with Victoria now. Her pain was real, her thinking believable. I'd been made the villain, the cruel academic who'd used a family's tragedy to plan professional revenge. You want to know what I think really happened? Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the building. I think you've resented me for years. Resented that I moved Daniel into the book world instead of your precious cooking scene. Resented that I couldn't appreciate your area of knowledge because it reminded me too much of my dead brother. Victoria was building to a high point now, her professional personality fully working. So you waited, you planned, you found the most expensive, most impressive piece of cooking history you could buy. Then you set me up to reject it so you could shame me in front of my friends and clients. She turned to me directly. The only question is, how long have you been planning this? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Victoria had successfully turned the tables, made herself the victim and me the planner. And the worst part was some of what she'd said was true. The building was completely silent, waiting for my response to Victoria's accusations. Every face was turned toward me, some feeling sorry, some doubtful, all expecting an explanation. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this young woman I'd watched struggle with grief for 4 years, now standing before her friends with tears in her eyes, convinced I'd planned her shame. Victoria, I said quietly, you're right about several things. The admission surprised everyone, including Victoria herself. I did hide my identity from you. I did choose to reveal it tonight, and I did know that French cooking would be difficult for you. Victoria's face grew happy, proven right. But I continued, you're wrong about why. Then explain it, Victoria demanded. I looked around the building at the faces of New York's book important people, watching this family drama happen. These weren't the circumstances I'd imagined for this talk, but perhaps they were the right ones. I hid my identity, I said, because you needed me to. Victoria's confidence shook. What? 4 years ago when you married Daniel, you were broken. Marcus's death had destroyed your relationship with cooking, and you were building a new life around book writing. The last thing you needed was a mother-in-law who would constantly remind you of the world you'd lost. I paused, letting that sink in. So, I became Maggie the baker, someone safe. Someone who wouldn't trigger your grief or make you feel like you had to pretend to love French cooking for family peace. Chef Klein was listening carefully. Robert had tears in his eyes. For 4 years, I continued, I watched you heal, watched you build confidence in the book world, watched you create a new identity that didn't include the weight of cooking genius lost too soon. Victoria's face was changing, her anger being replaced by confusion. But I also watched you become someone else, I said. Someone harder, meaner, more willing to look down on people you considered less smart. Victoria started. Tonight, I interrupted gently. You spent 20 minutes publicly mocking a gift from your mother-in-law because you thought she was too stupid to understand your cruelty. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. You performed your being better than others for an audience, I continued. Using someone you thought couldn't defend herself as entertainment for your friends. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. That's not the woman who married my son, I said. That's not the woman who loved Marcus enough to change her entire career path, rather than face daily reminders of his absence. Victoria was crying now, but silently. Victoria, I said, grief changes us. Sometimes it makes us harder, more defensive. We protect ourselves by deciding that other people aren't good enough for our consideration. Chef Klein stepped forward. If I may, Chef Wells, how did you know about Marcus? 'Cause I was there, I said simply. Victoria's head snapped up. Where? The Boston Food Festival, June 20th, 2016. The Young Chef Competition. Victoria went completely white. That was Marcus's last competition. No. But why were you there? You didn't know our family then. Daniel had mentioned his girlfriend's brother was competing in Boston. He was so excited about it. Kept talking about how talented Marcus was. How proud you were of him. Victoria's voice was barely hearable. You came to watch Marcus cook. I wanted to understand what kind of food mattered to the young woman my son was falling in love with. The building crowd was completely absorbed now, understanding they were watching something far more complex than professional shame. He was amazing, I continued. French onion soup, coco vin, and then as his final dish, don't, Victoria whispered. Recipes from Paris. The exact dishes from this cookbook. Victoria collapsed into a nearby chair, the cookbook still held in her hands. Robert was staring at me. Chef Wells, is this the same cookbook Marcus used that day? No, I said, but it's the same recipe collection. Chef Klein's eyes got wide. You mean there are multiple copies? I mean, I said carefully, that Marcus's cooking that day was so beautiful that I spent the next 3 years trying to find the original cookbook. When I finally found it in that estate sale, I had it checked specifically because I remembered how wonderfully he'd made those dishes. Victoria looked up at me through her tears. You bought this because of Marcus. I bought it to honor his memory. But why give it to me? Why now? I looked around the building one more time. Because I thought you were ready to remember Marcus with happiness instead of just pain. Victoria's voice broke. I'm not ready. I know that now. Robert was shaking his head in amazement. Chef Wells, this cookbook, if it's real child worth $750,000, why would you give it away? Because some things are worth more than money, I said simply. Chef Klein was studying the checking documents again. These are real. National Cooking Library, Christie's Child Foundation. This is the real thing. She looked up at Victoria. Do you understand what you're holding? Victoria stared down at the cookbook with new eyes. Marcus's recipes. More than that, Chef Klein said. You're holding a piece of cooking history that your brother brought to life. He may have been one of the only people ever to cook these exact dishes. Victoria's shoulders started shaking. 4 years of held-in grief were finally breaking through. I couldn't read his cooking blog after he died, she whispered. Couldn't bear to see his recipes, his ideas, it hurt too much. I know, I said. But this, Victoria held up the cookbook. This isn't just any recipes. This is Marcus's recipes. And you've been keeping it for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to me. Waiting for you to be strong enough to receive it. Victoria looked around the building at the faces watching her with care and understanding instead of judgment. Chef Wells, she said finally, I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing. Do. Victoria stood up, wiping her eyes. I've been cruel to you for 4 years, looking down mean. And tonight I shamed you in front of all these people. Victoria, no. Let me finish. Victoria turned to address the crowd. I spent the last hour showing everything wrong with thinking you're better than others. I assumed my mother-in-law was stupid because she didn't fit my fancy image. I mocked her gift without understanding its value. I performed cruelty for your entertainment. The building was completely silent. Chef Wells didn't plan my shame, Victoria continued. I planned it myself by choosing being better than others over curiosity, by choosing judgment over love. Victoria looked down at the cookbook one more time. This isn't just a child original worth nearly $1 million, she said to the room. It's a lesson in what we lose when we stop seeing the humanity in other people. And that's when the real healing began. Victoria sat back down, still holding the cookbook, and looked at me with a look I'd never seen before. Not the polite distance of our family dinners, not the professional courtesy of tonight's launch, but something raw and open. Chef Wells, she said quietly. Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Course. Do you remember anything else about that day? About Marcus's competition? He nodded. Every detail. He wore a white chef coat with navy blue buttons. He explained each dish to the judges himself, which was unusual for student competition. And before he cooked the recipes from Paris dishes, he said something I'll never forget. Victoria's breath caught. What did he say? He said, these next dishes were written for someone in Paris over 70 years ago. Today I get to bring their flavors back to life. Victoria broke down completely. Her professional composure broke, and she cried openly in front of the entire building. Daniel rushed to her side, wrapping his arms around her. "That's exactly what he would say," Victoria whispered through her tears. "Marcus always talked about cooking like it was alive, like chefs were writing letters to the future." I waited for her to collect herself before continuing. There was more she needed to know, and it wouldn't get easier. "Victoria, there's something else about that day." She looked up at me, still crying. "I stayed after the competition. I wanted to congratulate Marcus personally, to tell him how beautiful his cooking had been. He would have loved that. Marcus lived for feedback from chefs. I found him backstage with your parents. He was glowing, absolutely shining with the joy of what he'd just done." Victoria nodded. "That was the last time I saw him truly happy. We talked for about 15 minutes. He told me about his plans, culinary school applications, internships in France. His dream of opening a restaurant in Boston someday." Daniel was listening carefully now, learning about his wife's family history for the first time. "He also told me about his sister," I continued, "about Victoria, the book writer who was so proud of him that she'd taken the day off from her publishing job to watch him compete." Victoria's face crumpled. "He said that. He said you were the person who believed in his talent when everyone else thought cooking was an impractical career choice. He said you were his champion." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She'd forgotten in her grief that she'd once been Marcus's biggest supporter. "Chef Wells," she said finally. "What happened to him?" The official report said boating accident, but I hesitated. This was the part I'd hoped never to discuss. "Victoria, are you sure you want to know?" "I need to know. I've spent 4 years wondering." I looked around the building. The crowd had mostly left, sensing this conversation was becoming too private for public watching. Only Chef Klein, Robert, and a few close friends remained. "It wasn't a boating accident," I said quietly. Victoria's face went white. "What?" "Marcus called me 4 days after his competition performance. He was struggling." "Struggling how?" "The competition had been so perfect, so beautiful that he felt like he'd reached his peak. He was 23 years old and convinced he'd never cook that wonderfully again." Victoria shook her head. "That's impossible. Marcus was just getting started. That's what I told him. But he was dealing with something I didn't fully understand at the time. The pressure of perfection. The fear that his competition performance was the best he'd ever be." Daniel was crying now too. "Chef Wells, what are you saying?" "I'm saying Marcus didn't die in a boating accident. He took his own life 4 days after the most successful competition of his career." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria stopped breathing. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not the police said. The police said what your parents asked them to say. They couldn't bear for Marcus's death to cover up his cooking legacy." Victoria was shaking her head hard. "You're wrong. Marcus was happy that day. You said so yourself. He was happy that day, but happiness and hope aren't the same thing. Marcus was fighting demons none of us could see." Robert had covered his mouth with his hands. Chef Klein was staring at the floor. "Did he?" Victoria's voice broke. Did he say anything? Before I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He left a letter. Your parents gave me a copy because Marcus had mentioned our conversation in it. Victoria stared at the letter like it might burn her. What does it say? That's for you to decide. But Victoria, you should know. Marcus's death wasn't your fault. There was nothing you could have done. How can you know that? 'Cause he wrote about you. About how proud he was to be your brother, about how grateful he was for your support. His death wasn't about anything missing from his life. It was about the weight of his own expectations. Victoria took the letter with shaking hands, but didn't unfold it. Chef Wells, she said, why didn't my parents tell me the truth? Because you were 29 years old, just starting your book career. They'd already lost one child to the pressure of cooking perfectionism. They couldn't bear to lose you to guilt and survivor's guilt feelings. So they made up the boating accident. They told a story that would let you grieve without blame. It was an act of love. Victoria sat in silence for a long moment, holding both the letter and the cookbook. The child cookbook, she said finally. Was it really Marcus's favorite? According to his letter, yes. He wrote that cooking from it felt like having a conversation with child herself, like she'd written it specifically for him to discover. Chef Klein stepped forward gently. Victoria, if I may, I've seen this before. Young chefs who achieve beautiful moments and then become frozen by the fear they'll never reach those heights again. Marcus wasn't weak, Victoria said strongly. No one said he was weak. Mental illness isn't weakness, it's illness. Marcus was fighting a battle you couldn't see. Daniel was holding Victoria's hand now. Honey, maybe your parents were trying to protect you. From what? From the truth about my own brother. From guilt that would have destroyed you, I said. They watched Marcus struggle with perfectionism for years. They couldn't bear to watch you blame yourself for not seeing the signs. Victoria looked around the building at the books she'd surrounded herself with, at the life she'd built far from the world of French cooking. Is that why you became a book writer? Robert asked gently. To get away from food. Victoria nodded slowly. After Marcus died, I couldn't be around cooking without thinking about all the dishes he'd never make, all the restaurants he'd never open. But this cookbook, I said. This is food he did make. Dishes he brought to life. When you look at these recipes, you're not seeing what Marcus lost. You're seeing what he achieved. Victoria unfolded Marcus's letter and read it silently, tears streaming down her face. When she finished, she looked up at me with something close to peace. He mentions you, she said. He says the chef who stayed to talk with him after the competition reminded him why he loved cooking in the first place. Marcus reminded me why I loved cooking, I replied. Watching him cook that day was like seeing child's intentions come to life. Victoria stood up, still holding the cookbook. Chef Wells, I need to ask you something else. Anything. Would you teach me to cook these dishes? The request surprised everyone, including me. Victoria, you don't cook. I'm learning. I started lessons last month. It was supposed to be a surprise for Daniel. But now she held up the cookbook. Now I want to learn these recipes specifically. I want to cook Marcus's food. Daniel started crying again, but these were tears of happiness. Victoria, I said softly. It would be my honor to teach you your brother's favorite recipes. And in that moment, 4 years of careful distance between us finally collapsed into the family relationship we should have had all along. The immediate time after was quieter than I'd expected. The building crowd had mostly left, leaving just our small group to process what had happened. Victoria sat with Marcus's letter in one hand and the cookbook in the other, like a woman trying to balance her past and future. Chef Wells, Robert said softly. I owe you an apology. When Victoria was speaking in French earlier, I should have stopped it. You had no way of knowing what was happening. I should have trusted my gut feelings. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. Chef Klein was looking at the checking documents one more time. Chef, if you don't mind my asking, how did you pay for getting and checking this cookbook? The process you described would have cost tens of thousands. It was a fair question and one I'd expected. I inherited some money from my parents a few years ago, I said. And I'd been collecting rare cookbooks as investments for my retirement. When I found this collection and realized its connection to Marcus's competition, it seemed like the right use of those funds. Victoria looked up from Marcus's letter. Chef Wells, this cookbook is worth $750,000. You can't just give it away. I'm not giving it away, I replied. I'm entrusting it to Marcus's family. But your retirement. Victoria, I'm 71 years old. I have enough money to live comfortably. What I don't have is enough time to make this cookbook matter to someone who needs it. Daniel was crying again. Mom, you've been planning this for 3 years. Not planning exactly, hoping, waiting for the right moment. What if tonight had gone differently? Yes. What if Victoria had appreciated the gift without all the drama? Then I would have told her the story quietly over dinner. But sometimes the most important conversations happen in the least expected ways. Robert was shaking his head in amazement. This is going to become famous in the book world. The story of the chef who spent 3 years checking a cookbook just to give it to her grieving daughter-in-law. Actually, Chef Klein said, I think this story is going to reach far beyond the book world. The cooking community needs to hear about Marcus's legacy, about the cookbook, about the scholarship Chef Wells mentioned. Victoria looked confused. What scholarship? I realized I hadn't mentioned that part yet. The Marcus Chen Memorial Scholarship at Boston Culinary Institute. I established it after his death to help promising young chefs who might be struggling with the pressure he faced. Victoria stared at me. You created a scholarship in Marcus's name. The cooking world lost something precious when Marcus died. The scholarship is a way to make sure his legacy supports other young cooks. How much? Victoria asked quietly. $20,000 every year. It's enough to cover tuition for a talented student who might not otherwise be able to afford cooking school. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Chef Wells, can I contribute to that scholarship? Course. I want to increase it to $40,000 every year. And I want to expand it to include book writing students as well as cooking students, students who are dealing with the same pressures Marcus faced. Daniel squeezed her hand. Honey, that's beautiful. Marcus would have wanted to support all kinds of artists, Victoria said. He never believed in walls between art forms. Robert was wiping his eyes. Victoria, that's a wonderful way to honor his memory. Chef Klein pulled out her phone. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow. Several restaurant chefs I know would be interested in cooking recipes from Paris in Marcus's honor. We could organize a memorial dinner series. I like that, Victoria said. But only if Chef Wells thinks Marcus would have approved. Smiled. Marcus would have loved knowing his cooking was bringing people together. As we prepared to leave the building, Victoria carefully placed the cookbook back in its protective sleeve. Chef Wells, she said. Have one more request. What's that? Would you mind if we called you Margaret? I know you're Chef Wells to the rest of the world, but I'd like to think of you as family. Like that very much. Victoria extended her hand, then thought better of it and hugged me instead. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret, for keeping Marcus's memory alive when I couldn't. Thank you for trusting me with his story. As we walked out of the building together, Daniel between Victoria and me, our arms linked together, I realized that sometimes the most valuable gifts aren't the ones we give, but the ones we receive in return. Victoria had given me something I hadn't even known I was missing. A daughter who understood that love sometimes works in mysterious ways, and that the most powerful healing often comes through honoring what we've lost rather than running from it. 7 months later, I was sitting in Victoria and Daniel's apartment, watching my daughter-in-law's fingers move carefully across the kitchen counter. She was preparing the opening recipe from Recipes from Paris, her technique still uncertain, but her intention clear. "Remember," I said gently. Child wanted this to feel like a conversation, not a performance. "Let the flavors speak." Victoria nodded, adjusting her seasoning. The food that emerged was simple but heartfelt. Not the beautiful cooking Marcus had given it, but something equally valuable. A sister's love made edible. "Better," I said. "Marcus would be proud." Victoria smiled, continuing to cook. We'd been having weekly lessons since that night at the building, and slowly, carefully, she was rebuilding her relationship with cooking, not as the overwhelming force that had defined and ultimately claimed Marcus, but as a language of connection and memory. The cookbook itself was now professionally framed and mounted on the wall above their dining table, not as a museum piece, but as a living part of their home. Victoria had insisted on displaying the checking documents alongside it, not to prove its value, but to honor the journey that had brought it to her. "Margaret," Victoria said, pausing in her cooking, "Daniel and I have some news." I looked up from the recipe I'd been writing notes on. "We're pregnant," Daniel announced, his face glowing. "That's wonderful," I said, hugging them both. "Marcus would have been an amazing uncle." "Actually," Victoria said, "we've been talking about names. If it's a boy, we'd like to call him Marcus, but only if you think that would honor his memory properly." I felt tears come to my eyes. "I think Marcus would be honored to have his name carry forward." "And if it's a girl," Daniel added. "We were thinking Margaret, after the grandmother who taught us that love sometimes requires patience." I couldn't speak for a moment. 4 years of careful distance had led to this. A family united not by blood alone, but by shared understanding of loss, healing, and the courage to honor difficult truths. "Victoria," I said finally, "would you cook the recipe one more time? I'd like Marcus to see how beautifully you've learned his favorite dishes." As the gentle smells filled the room, I closed my eyes and remembered that day at the Boston Food Festival. Marcus's shining joy, Victoria's proud face in the audience, the impossible beauty of cooking bridging past and future. Sometimes the most powerful response really isn't the fastest one. Sometimes love works best when it's patient, when it waits for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. And sometimes the greatest gifts we can give are the ones that help others remember who they used to be. The scholarship fund had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. With Victoria's contributions and support from the cooking community, we were now helping 6 students every year, 3 cooking students and 3 book writing students. Each recipient received not just money, but mentorship, counseling support, and a community that understood the pressures of creative perfectionism. Chef Klein had organized the Memorial Dinner Series, and it had become an annual event. Chefs from across the country would gather to cook dishes from recipes from Paris, sharing stories about Marcus and raising awareness about mental health in the culinary world. The cookbook had become more than just a valuable artifact. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the things we create can outlive us and touch lives we'll never know. Victoria had published a book about her journey, titled Cooking Through Grief, A Sister's Story. It had become a bestseller, helping thousands of people who were struggling with loss and the pressure to be perfect. She donated all the profits to the scholarship fund. Daniel had started volunteering with a mental health organization, using his experience to help other families navigate the complicated emotions of losing someone to suicide. Together, they were building a legacy that honored Marcus not just for what he achieved, but for the conversations his story had started. As I sat in their apartment that day, watching Victoria cook with growing confidence, I thought about all the moments that had led to this. The estate sale in Vermont where I'd found the cookbook, the years of authentication work, the decision to hide my identity, the painful revelation at the book launch. Every choice, every moment had been necessary. If I'd revealed my identity earlier, Victoria wouldn't have been ready. If I'd handled the book launch differently, the healing wouldn't have gone as deep. Sometimes love requires us to wait, to watch, to let people make mistakes and find their own way back. The cookbook on the wall caught my eye, its aged paper preserved behind protective glass. Those recipes, written by Julia Child over 70 years ago, had traveled an impossible journey to reach this moment. From Paris to Vermont to my hands to Marcus's kitchen to Victoria's wall. And now they were beginning a new journey into the hands of my future grandchild, who would grow up knowing their uncle's story, understanding the importance of mental health, learning that perfection isn't the goal, connection is. Margaret, Victoria said, pulling me from my thoughts. Do you think Marcus would be happy with how things turned out? I stood up and joined her at the kitchen counter, looking at the dish she'd prepared. It wasn't perfect. The sauce was a little thick, the presentation could be better. But it was made with love, and that made it beautiful. I think Marcus would be proud of you, I said. Not because you're cooking perfectly, but because you're cooking at all. Because you're facing the thing that scared you most and turning it into something that helps others. Victoria wiped her eyes. I miss him every day. I know you do. But he's here, I gestured around the apartment. In this cookbook, in the scholarship, in the students we're helping, in the baby you're carrying. Marcus's legacy isn't what he lost. It's what he gave us. Daniel joined us at the counter, wrapping his arms around both of us. Thank you, Mom, he said. For everything. For waiting. For knowing. For loving us enough to let us find our own way. As we stood there together, 3 generations connected by loss and love and the patience to heal, I realized that this was what family really meant. Not perfection, but presence. Not avoiding pain, but walking through it together. Not hiding who we are, but revealing ourselves at exactly the right moment. The French phrase Victoria had used that night at the book launch came back to me. She'd called me someone who knew nothing about culture, someone too simple to understand real value. But she'd been wrong. Culture isn't about knowing fancy things or speaking fancy languages. Culture is about understanding what matters, about valuing connection over perfection, about having the patience to let love work in its own time. I'd spent 4 years hiding my identity, letting Victoria think I was just a simple baker. But in doing so, I'd given her something more valuable than any credential or title. I'd given her space to heal, time to grow, and finally, when she was ready, the truth she needed to move forward. That's what real love looks like. Not the showy kind that demands recognition, but the quiet kind that waits in the wings, ready to step forward exactly when needed. Victoria put her hand on her belly, where my future grandchild was growing. What will we tell them about all this? She asked. About Marcus, about the cookbook, about that night. We'll tell them the truth, I said. That love is complicated, that grief is hard, that healing takes time. We'll tell them that their uncle was brilliant and troubled, that he created beautiful things and struggled with impossible pressures. We'll tell them that their grandmother hid who she was to protect their mother, and that their mother learned to cook again to honor their uncle. And most importantly, I continued, we'll tell them that perfection isn't the goal. Connection is. That the most valuable things in life aren't the ones that cost the most money, but the ones that cost the most courage. Victoria smiled through her tears. Marcus would have loved that. He would have loved all of this. He does love it, I said. Wherever he is, he's watching and he's proud. Not because we're perfect, but because we're trying. Because we're taking his story and using it to help others. Because we're turning tragedy into hope. As the sun set outside their apartment window, casting golden light across the cookbook on the wall, I thought about all the lives that had touched this collection of recipes. Julia Child, writing them in Paris decades ago. The unknown people who'd owned them over the years. Mrs. Romano's sister, keeping them safe in Vermont. Marcus, bringing them to life at his competition. And now Victoria, learning to cook them for her child. That's what art does. That's what cooking does. That's what love does. It travels through time, connecting people across generations, carrying messages. The cookbook was worth $750,000 according to Christie's. But its real value couldn't be measured in money. Its value was in the healing it brought, the conversations it started, the hope it represented. Victoria turned off the stove and plated the food she'd prepared. 3 servings, arranged simply on white plates. Let's eat, she said. Marcus. To Marcus, Daniel and I echoed. As we sat down together to share the meal Victoria had made from her brother's favorite recipes, I realized this was what I'd been waiting for. Not the dramatic revelation at the book launch, not the tears or the apologies, but this quiet moment of family, connected by food and love and the courage to remember. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's healing. It's patience. It's loving people enough to wait for them to find their way back to themselves. Victoria had mocked me in French that night, thinking I couldn't understand. But I'd understood everything, not just the words, but the pain behind them, the fear, the grief she was trying to hide. And instead of striking back immediately, I'd waited. I'd let the moment unfold. I'd trusted that truth would find its way to the surface. That's the power of patience. That's the power of love. That's the power of knowing when to speak and when to wait. As I took a bite of the food Victoria had prepared, I smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. Just like us. Just like our family. Just like life. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If you enjoyed this story from Granny's voice, please subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Remember, the most powerful response isn't always the immediate one. Sometimes love requires patience, and the best gifts are the ones that help others heal. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that perfection isn't the goal, connection is. And that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope for healing. Thank you for watching, and remember, whether you're dealing with grief, struggling with family relationships, or just trying to find your way, you're not alone. Take your time. Be patient with yourself. And know that the people who truly love you will wait for you to find your way back. This is Margaret Wells, reminding you that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply being present, being patient, and being ready to catch someone when they're finally ready to fall into healing. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.